Hello, everyone. If you could all find seats, this is a great attendance. I'm so impressed on a rainy day. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nan Crowder, and I'm the Dean of the College of Health and Human Development. And on behalf of our students, faculty, and staff and alumni, I'm really delighted to welcome you to the Distinguished Alumni Speaker Series. The Distinguished Alumni Speaker Series is the brainchild of the College of Health and Human Development's Alumni Society. In 2005, the Board of Directors of the Alumni Society established the Speaker Series in order to celebrate alumni who have been very successful in their professional lives and to allow these alumni to share their knowledge and expertise not only with students in our college, but with the entire university community. The first lecture in the series occurred 7 years ago when Wendy Owen spoke about her role in communicating with the media and the public about the Shuttle Columbia tragedy. Other speakers include Olympic bronze medalist Mary Ellen Clark, brain injury advocate Joanne Finnegan, voice disorders expert Bob Hillman, Patty Hilkirk, founder of a camp for HIV-positive children, and space flight nutrition expert Scott Smith. I'd like to thank the Alumni Society for its vision in establishing this speaker series and for continually striving to create opportunities for our faculty and students to benefit from our alumni network, which is now more than 60,000 alumni strong. I would now like to invite Dave McClung, president of the HHD Alumni Society and an alumnus of HPA, to come to the podium to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Dave?
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Susan Robinson. And it's kind of a challenging introduction because, like the title of our talk today, Susan can't really be labeled very well. She doesn't have one single job title or one easy description that sums her up. She's a speaker, but not just any speaker. She gave a TED Talk that has over 1.3 million views, and she was a resident with the TED organization where she spent her time engaging numerous organizations trying to discover how disability is viewed in the workplace and how talent can be cultivated. Susan can also be labeled as an entrepreneur. She is CEO and founder of Global Health Aspiraction, a public health consulting group that links patients with chronic, complex, and difficult to treat diseases with care providers. She started this company with an impressive background in the healthcare field. She's also served in senior roles in the area of community health, and public policy at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And prior to that, she worked in the non-for-profit arena at the American Liver Foundation and the Children's Health Fund. One might also label Susan as disabled, but if you watched her TED Talk, you'll learn she really failed at that. In 1992, Susan was diagnosed with genetic visual impairment that left her legally blind. Through a combination of humor, her outgoing personality, and her ability to communicate with others, Susan has become an advocate for people with disabilities and an explorer of what it means to be disabled. Susan is a 1994 graduate of the Health Policy and Administration program, and she's currently serving on the Alumni Council of the Penn State Alumni Association. Her talk today is titled, "Disabled, You Are Not Who They Say You Are." So please join me in a State College welcome, Susan Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, you bet.
Thank you. I actually have this one on. Yeah.
Sorry.
Should we have some fun? Actually, can I take a picture of you all? Because you're amazing. Look at you. This is incredible. Is that okay? I have to get as far back as I can to try to get everybody. Everybody say cheese. Cheese. Okay. Thank you for that. So I thought I'd start out with, it's a story that I haven't often shared. It wasn't until thinking about today that it came to mind. And the summer between my sophomore and junior years, I enrolled in intercession. For those of you who don't know, I think everybody knows, it's the first part of the summer session here at Penn State. And for the first time, I was assigned housing in Nittany Apartments on campus. And up until that point, I had been relegated to the dorms. And so this was a huge upgrade for me, and I was very excited. And I walked into my assigned apartment, and I came face to face, though I say that loosely, with 3 very tall women. And the conversation went something like, "Hi, I'm Susan." And they were like, "No, you're not." And I was like, "Yes, I'm Susan Robinson." And they said, "No, you're not." And I was really confident in who I was. And they seemed really confident in who I was not. And the 3-on-1 plus the height differential made me a little bit nervous about how I should move forward, about my next strategic offensive or defensive move. So I figured that the proof was in my pocket, and I pulled out my student ID that certified that I was Susan Robinson. The funny thing was that 3 other students at Penn State at that time also could have pulled out an ID that certified them as Susan Robinson as well. Obviously, the pictures would have been different. And one of those Susan Robinsons was a star on the women's basketball team. So we all quickly realized what had happened and that I indeed was in the right place, and it surely was a mix-up from the housing department, who may not have realized how many of us there were on campus. But what was interesting about that situation is that my name, my label, my first label, my most personal label came into question. And it, at the time, really didn't make me think one way or the other, but subsequently, I've really thought about labels and how we're so used to them in a way that we really don't question them. And when labels do get questioned, particularly those that are very much rooted in culture or expectation or history, we can sometimes be a little bit in a hot seat for questioning them. Now, the timing of that particular situation was pretty interesting because just 8 weeks prior, I had gotten a new label. I had found myself in the office of a retina specialist. The retina is the back part of the eye where the picture comes in upside down and then comes back out. And I was on the receiving end of a "we only see this in textbooks" kind of diagnosis. And I was told that I was visually impaired, legally blind, and it was a genetic visual impairment that has no correction or cure, and ultimately at the time, no way of telling how much vision I would lose over time either. So for most people, they would label that kind of situation as a defining moment in life. But for me, it was more pragmatic than profound because I had spent 3.5 semesters up until that point with not quite the same academic excellence that I had seen in high school. And although I will not confirm or deny how much of my social schedule played an impact on that, even though the statute of limitations is well expired because my parents are in the room today, I knew at the time, and I know for certain now, obviously, that the totality of my extracurricular activities were not the most significant impact on my less than stellar academic performance. So with diagnosis in hand, I kind of said, great, now I know how to fix this. I had spent too much time saying, Mom, I need my contacts changed, I can't get all the notes in class. Mom, I need my glasses changed, I can't finish tests. So now I had an answer that I could go to my professors to say, this is what I need, and can you help, and how do we make this work? Because I just need a different kind of pathway than most everybody else. The second thing that went through my mind is having been told that I needed to think very carefully about my career. I had entered Penn State in the Eberly College of Science. I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon, and I was a diligent biology student. And I sat back in that retina specialist office and I thought to myself, well, if I can't operate in a hospital, I'll just operate the entire hospital. And I knew a number of folks who were in this major called Health Policy and Administration. So, yes, woo! So I decided to just switch gears in that moment, and I enthusiastically joined the College of Health and Human Development in a major called Health Policy and Administration. The diagnosis, interestingly enough, from a pragmatic point of view, just also taught me that I just needed to take a different pathway than everybody else to my ultimate destination. And it never was something that had me sit back on my heels to say that I couldn't do anything. And Penn State, as we all know, and probably expect, was a tremendous support in that transition and creating opportunity for anything I needed to be successful, and never took the opportunity to say, you can't do that, or don't you think you shouldn't do that, or don't you want to reconsider? Whatever I asked and whatever I needed, Penn State was there to support, as was the College of Health and Human Development, as was every professor that I ever asked for their notes ahead of class, or extra time to finish a test, or a large print test. Penn State just made it happen with me. So I entered the world thinking that this is how the world was. And boy, was I wrong. So over the years, I've come to appreciate that the so-called normal world generally has 4 responses to me. And as I've talked to lots of other people over the years, and particularly during my TED residency, these are not foreign to other folks who are outside of the so-called normal group, if you will. And the first one is, I'm going to intonate it as best as I possibly can. Wow, Susan, look at everything you do in your career, in your life. How do you do all of that and you're visually impaired? And I find it incredibly curious because the root of that, to me, is a little bit of missing on the creative problem solving, sort of like, how can a blind person ride a bike? And you might sit and think, and you don't have to admit if you just did, how does a blind person ride a bike? And the creative solution to that is a tandem bike. So about 2 years ago, I was introduced to a tandem cycling program in New York called In Tandem, actually. And they find real fully sighted, 20/20 sighted cyclists and other volunteers who will ride on the front seat of a bike. And those of us with visual impairments who are totally blind, some of us, ride on the back seat of the bike, and we cycle everywhere. And I have an upcoming 40-mile ride that I'm doing with a captain, and we have all sorts of things that are going on. But it's always very curious when I say, oh, I go cycling, and the head tilt happens. Like, huh, we didn't think that would be safe for you. Also under the wow factor is that that's rooted in a level of surprise. And surprise is rooted in a level of expectation. Like something couldn't happen, but it did. So if, wow, Susan, look at all you've accomplished and you're visually impaired is true, that would mean that accomplishment is a function of 20/20 vision. And the first 100 times I heard it, I was sort of like, oh, you silly, fully sighted people. You do the same thing if you were in my shoes. But as the comment came over and over, year after year, I started to sit back and think about not only the statement and sort of breaking it down as I just did, but also the context by which someone was sharing it with me. And not to sound braggadocious, but there were times where I noticed that the person who was so surprised, wow, look at everything you've accomplished, didn't have as much accomplishment as I did, and didn't have a visual impairment. And so the logic actually doesn't work in both directions, but what I've learned is that the fully sighted world doesn't really like to talk about that, so let's just move on. The second thing that people often come to me with is a comment like, you're faking it. And it's really kind of interesting for someone like me and others who have something that's not noticeable to the naked eye per se. And it's really difficult to appeal to the logic of a 20/20 sighted person who thinks that I have successfully infiltrated their world. So the faking it thing is, again, really kind of interesting because it's rooted in misperception. Blindness is complete darkness, and the opposite is 20/20 vision, either with corrective lenses like contacts or glasses. Similarly, you could apply that logic to someone who uses a wheelchair. You either can walk totally or you are completely incapacitated. There's nothing in the middle that perhaps someone has a balance issue or just long-term mobility issues or stamina issues. Or they just had a hip replacement. So this misperception issue is really kind of interesting because, again, it doesn't allow for the permission to the possibility that other options exist. So with my vision, the way my eye works, I can see movement best. And because of how my eye gets so much practice at seeing movement, I actually see things like something rolling on the floor much faster than a 20/20 sighted person ever could. But I won't know if it's a bottle cap or a mouse or a quarter, so I just jump out of the way just to be conservative. And so what's interesting is in that faking it mode, folks have said to me, "You said you couldn't see." And I've learned that the best way to shut that conversation down is to say, "You said you could." Because you sort of don't know what to do with that. The third thing that people often say, and this one is actually my favorite, though it has its downsides, is I forget that you're visually impaired. So several years ago, I was down in Washington, D.C. with a colleague, and we were attending the opening of a breast cancer center that had the newest 3D mammography technology. It was so super cool, and the building was very new, and the interior design matched the modern technology that was available inside. As we were leaving, we were walking down the hallway, and my colleague walked through a doorway, and me, just a few inches to her right, crashed into a glass wall, and hopefully gracefully ricocheted off of it. And she turned towards me, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just forget," which, again, is great, because it's acknowledging what I actually can do, the strengths I bring to the table, but it really does eliminate the times where I do need adult supervision, because that exists. And finally, the thing that comes at me a lot, as Dave actually mentioned, is being called disabled. And this one is a little bit newer. When I started interfacing a little bit more with the vision and vision loss community, and this labeling, and even sometimes aggressively so, was just sort of part and parcel of the discussion. And from my point in diagnosis and my time here at Penn State, my additional academic time and my work and my career, that had never been a word that was applied to me. And so I was really confused about why that would be the case. And then I started to hear from people that they were concerned that I was going to get their benefits taken away from them because the classification allowed them certain services and other things. And not to be flippant about that point, but if I had that much power, Saquon Barkley would have a Heisman Trophy. Creamery ice cream would be calorie-free. And, well, everybody everywhere would have all the food and clean water that they ever needed. And that would be the start of my list. The word disabled is actually pretty interesting nowadays, too, because it covers such a breadth of people. It covers individuals who need 24-hour care in order to accomplish activities of daily life, and it also covers half of the working population. So it's a very widely applied term for different kinds of people within that population. Now, I'm all for classification because I understand that the world can really be a difficult place. And if doorways weren't wide enough for wheelchairs, or if things for me weren't in large print, the world would be really inaccessible. And there are people who need things, and the classification is really important. But the vernacular is a really curious one. Because if you break down disabled, it means unabled, not capable. On one hand, how is a person incapable of being human? No one's been able to answer that one for me. But another thing that I hear all the time, I live in New York, and man, the rush hour traffic is crazy. So glad I don't drive. Can't drive. I can drive. It's just dangerous for everybody involved. They often talk about a disabled car that's broken down on the George Washington Bridge that's blocking up traffic for hours, causing everyone to be late for work. And obviously, people are getting very frustrated, and New Yorkers don't particularly have a lot of patience, as you probably know. Or here in Pennsylvania, cars that are broken down at the side of the highway, and they're disabled. This disabled car, because it's not functioning, it's not capable of functioning for what it's been designed. So as long as the same word that's used to describe that broken down car is the same word that's used to describe me by others, I'm just going to have a sassy attitude about it. That's all there is to it. Quite frankly, I don't want to be called Joseph, right? And I certainly don't want to be called a Buckeye. No offense to any Ohio State people who are watching. And all of that, all of what comes to me is so different than what I've learned throughout my career. So as Dave mentioned, I have worked across sectors. I've worked in government very early on in my career, several different kinds of not-for-profits in the corporate sector, the entrepreneurial sector. I've also been able to work at all levels within an organization, so at an individual contributor level up to executive leadership and governance, and now in an advisory and consulting capacity. I've hired and I've fired, and I promise you I've never done so because someone is 20/20 sighted. It's really all about talent. So how do we assess talent regardless of packaging? One of the things that I think is interesting in our culture is the definition of success and failure. So I've talked about this a lot with my teams, because I usually change their perception a little bit when we work together. So success is generally defined as, say, going for 90 and getting 91. You've exceeded the goal, therefore you have been successful. But what happens if you go for 100 and you get 97? That would typically be considered a failure. But 97 is greater than 91, so which really is the success and which really is the failure? A culture of innovation and industry interrupters has underscored what is really failure. There's a company that we all probably have an account with that they get about 50% of every online dollar spent. You all know which one I'm talking about, I'm sure. And for the first 6 years of that business, it made no money. And in the corporate world, that's not a success. But now all these years later, in playing the long game, the long-range plan, they're one of the most successful global companies that exists. So what really is success and what really is failure? The other thing I've learned, having supervised lots of folks and having the opportunity to cultivate professionals from early stages in their career, including HPA interns from Penn State, I really understand that nobody has it all. No one person has every skill set honed to perfection for every situation of every minute of every day for their entire lives. So if nobody has it all, and everyone's continuing to learn over the course of their career, how does me not having vision somehow become the focal point of how I'm judged as an abled person or a competent person? The other thing I've learned, again, in building my teams is that there are situational strengths. So no one has it all, but folks really bring to the table stuff that they naturally do really well. The best team I ever led in my career was based on those strengths and applying them where they needed, and some of our fancy names that we gave to ourselves were the pillar of masterly acumen, and the biscuit butterer, and the voice of reason, because you always need to have one of those. So the pillar of masterly acumen was such an incredible subject matter expert that he actually caught the mistakes of individuals technically more knowledgeable than he was, and through layers of review, mistakes would get through and he would catch them. It was incredible. The biscuit butterer was an introvert. for those of us who we maybe spoke with earlier. And as an introvert, he really did not like to be externally facing with all of the stuff that the rest of the team had to do. But he really enjoyed being behind the scenes, preparing all of the things that any of us needed in order to be successful with our externally facing work. So if you think about how delicious it would be to just eat a buttered biscuit as opposed to having to butter the biscuit yourself, that's where he got his name. And the voice of reason was pretty interesting because, again, you always need one. And her superpower was really being able to ground us all when our lofty goals and aspirations for what our team could do exceeded our resources of funding, time, or even our own abilities, because sometimes we had an overinflated sense of self of what we could do. And she was able to bring us back down. So the situational application of their strengths and putting those all together created the best possible team that exceeded expectations in a lot of ways. It's not unlike building an awesome football team, quite frankly. And having gone to Penn State, that's an analogy that I often use. But I recently was coached that not everybody gets football. So I've added an orchestra. But earlier we did talk about how a piano is a spectacular instrument. But we don't see it in the blue band because it has its situational strengths. In the same way a wide receiver and a defensive lineman wouldn't naturally swap places because they're slotted where their strengths go best. And finally, one of the things that I've learned in working with lots of different folks, and particularly people who are wanting to grow in a career, is that a diagnosis like mine is actually a benefit. Most people spend their careers, and sometimes their lives, putting up the best possible version of themselves, because in a success-driven world, how can you be imperfect? In a success-driven world, how can you make a mistake? And here I come walking into the room saying, can't see ya, glad to meet you. If I see you 10 minutes from now, I'm not going to recognize you. Don't take it personally. So one of the first things I say is, I can't do something. I'm going to need your help. And the ability to open up clear communication, transparent communication, particularly in the workplace, layered with the ability to pull things out from other people, to really pull out their best strengths, but create a safe space of where they can say, I'm not really good at this either. How should I go about fixing it? Really allows for good and realistic expectations to be set, and for teamwork to really cultivate. Recently, I was talking with a global executive, the kinds that you read about in Forbes magazine, and he was saying that in his 360 evaluations, people find him intimidating. And considering his place on the org chart, that's probably a natural expectation, but as we talked a little bit more, we realized that he was just an ENTJ. So for those of you who know Myers-Briggs, it's a particular personality type that's highly analytical, very engaging, very personable, very driven, and a born leader. And those kinds of folks, particularly when they really get going with a lot of momentum, a lot of other people can't keep up, and the intimidation factor layered with the place on the org chart is something that ENTJs often hear in the workplace. So all of those things put together have really juxtaposed the things that I've gotten from the world because I'm not exactly sure how I'm so different. And so 3 things have kind of emerged over time about how success is really accessible to pretty much anybody. And first is the want and the need and the drive in a lot of ways to be highly curious and always interested in learning about something. The second piece is to be ready to pivot at any time. Opportunity shows up when you sometimes least expect it, and capitalizing on it, particularly when it's a great fit for your particular situational strengths, allows tremendous growth and success. And finally, as a friend of mine likes to say, and I've stolen this from him as he knows, I'm just too stubborn to accept the limitations that somebody else wants to put on me. Because why should I be defined by what somebody else thinks is possible when not only can I define it myself, but I've been empowered by one of the best universities in the world to shoot for the stars. So it's interesting that, again, that first label of mine was kind of called into question when I'm standing looking up all those summers ago. And I think that conversation could have gone a little bit better if all four of us had given permission to the possibility that a 5'5" Susan Robinson could actually be put into housing with 3 excellent Division I student athletes. I actually never would have really given that any permission, because when I was in elementary school, being picked second to last in gym class was a good day. And so all I can say is that I'm not quite sure where basketball Susan Robinson stayed that summer, but I know that her teammates were excellent roommates, and I think in their eyes I lived up to their height, to my height. I lived up to my height in their eyes. Thank you so much.
So we have some time for questions. Thank you so much, Susan. That was so good. And we've got a mic we can pass around. So please, questions or comments from any of you? Bob.
Maybe you can hear me without a microphone?
Yes, we can.
We're going to do the mic.
Oh, we need the mic because we're streaming.
Oh, for the live stream.
Thank you. I must say that I was drawn to the talk by your extraordinarily wonderful title, and you delivered on all of what I expected it to be. So thank you very much.
I'm so glad.
The story's wonderful also. You used as one of your examples a major corporation whose initials are probably well known, as you implied, and it might be the same initials as somebody named Frank Benjamin, but you characterize them as being unsuccessful for 5 years and then very successful now. Certainly, financially, that's the case. Would you think that they've been successful in all regards that we might for a large corporation?
Oh, that's a good question.
I had the wrong corporation, so what do I know?
I think we are talking about 2 different corporations based on what you just said.
I think he means Facebook, and I was thinking Amazon.
Right.
It's maybe neither.
Actually, I was talking about Facebook, but
not Facebook.
Both Facebook and Amazon have had very similar problems.
Okay.
So,
right. So the purpose of me bringing up that particular example was really defining, in a very transactional, linear way, success versus failure. And you've opened up a great opportunity to talk more broadly about long-term success and impact. I think companies have a responsibility to look at the totality of how they're operating in the world. One of the things that I learned actually being on campus is that the Penn State recycling system is amazing. Like, it beats Seattle by a long shot. And Seattleites are pretty regimented in their recycling pieces. So I think when we're looking at the success of a company, there's definitely economic success, and if it's a for-profit, publicly traded company, that can often be driven by Wall Street and the bottom line. I think if you're looking at that same question from an HR point of view, it's the quality of how employees are treated, how employees are cultivated, the work-life balance, and their ability to be their best when they're at work. I have found, particularly on the not-for-profit side, my experience was a little bit different in the corporate side, that those 2 things create a natural tension with each other. And the finance folks and the HR folks are usually sort of pulling at what we need and what we don't want to spend kind of thing. Because what we need often comes with a spend. Then there's the opportunity to be socially responsible to the environment and to other things that are important to the company. I think where I can angle this a little bit and root it in my own experience is corporate social responsibility and corporate philanthropy. And where that's tracked over time is the need and the want for everyone to benefit from those activities. I think where the difference and the challenge that we're all facing now is where policy and law has not kept up with technology. They grow at two very, very different rates. The willingness of corporations to define their own set of standards of excellence and perhaps a moral code, it could be argued, and how much onus of responsibility they put on individuals or participants. I think when it comes to technology, it is not my area of expertise, but I have some folks who really are in that space. And the want for people, initially hackers, just to have some fun, has turned into a complete industry that kind of like this is not the best example, but the one that's coming to mind, is that a burglar trying to get into a house. So if the burglar really wants to get into the house, they're going to keep trying, and you can put up a dog, and they can maybe take care of that, and you put up an alarm system, and they can figure a way around that, sort of Mission Impossible style or Ocean's 11 style. I don't think there's any one answer, and I sure as heck don't have it. But I ultimately think that executives for companies need to bear the responsibility for the totality of their impact, be it direct or unintended, because as leaders, regardless of what we're doing, both of those are our responsibility.
Yes. You do. I don't know why I'm picking all these people so far away.
So if you do have a question, the reason why we're running up with the mic is so that your voice and question is captured on the live stream, and if you're talking without the mic, it won't get picked up.
So right now you are speaking to a room full of like mostly college students, I would say. A lot of people are here my age. And so you don't really have one job title or one position in society, but yet I would stay here and say that you're very successful.
Okay.
So what kind of advice would you give to seniors or anybody that's trying to match their passions to and their beliefs to existing places in society?
So sort of like finding a job?
Yeah, how do you find your way?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. How do you find a job? Or should we even get one? I mean...
Well, I will say, in the spirit of ongoing curiosity, I would still be matriculated myself if my parents were still willing to pay the tuition. They cut that off a long time ago. So my advice for getting a job, well, that actually wasn't your question. Your advice, your question, I think, was more about my advice towards your approach to success. Would you say that that's correct? Yeah. Great. One of the things that I love about your generation, and I think you all are the Gen Z generation, per my experience, so I'm going to take us on a little journey before I answer your question, but this sets up what I'm about to say. When I interact with baby boomers, they're the folks that are sort of like, oh, you're disabled. Not everybody, but there's a little
Careful.
bit. And I know, and it's not everybody. Yes, yes. Yes, Dean? It's not everybody, but disproportionately, if I look at the language and the response to me and put it across cohorts, the baby boomers and Gen Xers sort of fall into that language. Older than baby boomers, bless their little hearts, I know there are some of you in this room, but none of you that I know have ever said this to me, have used the word afflicted. Your affliction, your affliction. And a little while ago, I was having a conversation with a gentleman who self-identified as 70-something years old, and your affliction, and I interrupted him because I was so frustrated, and I said, I must assure you that my only affliction is my inability to keep my mouth shut. Which he got the message, bless his little heart, and as we continued the conversation, it was interesting for me to watch that grammatically he would get to a sentence where he wanted to use the word affliction. He knew that that was not the right word to use with me, So he was trying to find a substitute word that I would not take issue with. And my ultimate problem was the DNA of the thinking, because it doesn't matter about the word substitution. As culture and society has moved forward and is now embracing diversity and inclusion in ways that we have never seen before, what I've noticed about Gen Zs is that when I say something like, oh, by the way, I'm visually impaired, you all shrug it off like I said, I'm wearing a sweater. You're like, all right, whatever. Because you're so used to whatever anybody brings to the table that your ability to just work with someone seems just so easy to me. So that's why I set that up that way. So your question about how should I approach success in my career and life, I would say that the foundations that your generation are putting in place now are setting an example for the rest of us about the ways we can behave with each other that are kinder and more inclusive and more acknowledging of the benefit that everyone brings to the table. So I would definitely stick with that because I think you guys got it going on there. From a job point of view, I would say the first thing is to identify what you're passionate about. Because when you do what you're passionate about, when you do what you love, it kind of doesn't feel like work. When you get into a role, I would make sure that to the best of your ability, you're doing the things that you like and the things that you're good at. So kind of like a wide receiver is quick and has really good hands, and the defensive lineman is just brawn and great force. If they swap places, they're not going to be as successful. So really knowing what you do best and aligning that with the jobs that you're looking for makes a lot of sense. As you continue to grow in your career, I'd be ensuring that you're surrounding yourself with the kind of people who are pursuing the kinds of excellence and the kinds of goals that you're pursuing. Sometimes that can be a little bit difficult, but it's really worth it. And finally, I'd say stay connected to Penn State. It's one of the best networks you could ever find. We really help each other. And when I travel around the country and even sometimes the world and I run into Penn Staters, we're just always making sure that we're looking out for each other and everything's okay. One of the things that I told of the 2 classes that I got to visit with earlier today is to begin your networking early. So in a job search kind of way, it's a little bit different at the individual contributor level, but most jobs, if you break it down, are found 10% by putting in a resume, 20% by working with a recruiter, which is a kind of person who's hired to find people for a job, and it's 70% networking. So get to know your classmates and get to know your neighbors and get to know your professors, because everybody knows somebody that ultimately they could help you out in the same way that you could help them out. I would also advise you to get a personal board of directors, so people that you can ask advice of and check in with them about what they would do in a particular situation so that you're really getting a diverse opinion on something that you might be grappling with a little bit. And I'd really be thinking about what the end goal is, because the decision that you make today, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like it, has ripple effect in your long-range plan. So whatever you do today, make sure it's directed towards what you really want to do. That answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Yes. Wait for the mic, please.
Hi.
Hi.
So what advice or recommendations can you give to other disabled people in like the workplace or in like a school setting?
So you've got to do what's right for you ultimately. I'm tracking this towards disclosure. And if you're wanting to unpack something a little bit different, let me know and we can go there too. I am very forthcoming. What I learned early on, so I was in a job interview a long time ago, and it looked like maybe the job was going to come through. And I know that in bringing me on, an employer has to spend a little extra funding to make sure that I have a large screen and certain things just so I can do the job. And I thought that that would be fair to offer. And so when I said I just wanted to let you know that I have a visual impairment and I come with all of my little visual aids, but I will need a large monitor, and it's no issue, and I've been successful academically and in my internships, and I really don't see it to be an issue, but I just think it's important for you to know. She looked at me and she said, well, you hide it very well. And as a sassy pants at the time in particular, I was like, well, I don't hide it at all, which is why I told you. And so for me, the disclosure thing is just sort of part and parcel, because I'd rather be able to get ahead of the surprise, because as I've been told, I don't look like I'm visually impaired. And oftentimes when somebody sees me do something weird, like walk into a glass wall or fall down a flight of stairs, they usually think that it's more of a cognitive issue. So I just kind of like to get ahead of it. But again, it goes back to that transparent conversation and being able to set realistic expectations. I have mistaken an Asian man for my mom. If you've seen my TED Talk, it is true. And it actually happened at Beaver Stadium, by the way. So there are just some realities of my life that I just think it's important for people to know. Disclosure is a personal thing, though. It's not for everyone, and every situation is not one to disclose. I don't walk into a restaurant and say, I'm visually impaired, can somebody read me the menu? I just might say to somebody, to the server, like, what's your favorite thing on the menu? And if it sounds good to me, I'll be like, great, I'll have that. And I don't need to disclose anything at all. I've still gotten where I'm going through a different path. So I would really think about what are the criteria by which disclosure makes sense, and I'd really be thinking about how that discussion happens and how one can lead that discussion in a very positive, forward-focused kind of way. For individuals who would check off a box on a job application that says disabled, some of the advice that I've gotten from my colleagues in the human resources space, particularly at executive levels, have encouraged me to both know and to share that Fortune 100 and 200 companies in particular are resourced in such a way through their human resources process that that checkbox on the form is an analytic issue. Sorry. So they'll take the information from the application, not even really look at it, just send it to a third party, and the third party will do the data crunching to say, for job X, you had 1,000 applicants, and of the 1,000 applicants, 4% checked off the yes, I am disabled box. In companies that aren't, for companies that don't have those levels of resources, you may have a staffing assistant who sees that on a checkoff box, not know what it means, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, the word disabled covers such a breadth of people, including 50% of the workforce. If someone isn't sure what it means, and human resources people are people too, and they say, well, maybe I don't know if that's going to be more difficult. We might have to change the entire infrastructure to create desks that are high enough for wheelchairs, or we might have to change the entire technology system to enable screen readers for people, for someone who might be totally blind. And if they sort of go on that track, they might just take the application and put it to the side and say no thanks. So my HR folks have really encouraged me to share with anyone that tracking towards companies that support the diversity and inclusion and the success of all of their workforce as the ones to really go for from an employee point of view. There are some ways to go about doing that. LinkedIn is a great tool. I think a lot of you have a LinkedIn account. And you can do some quick searches and find people, and this is where it goes back to building your network and people who help you and people who you can help. But finding someone who may work at a company and asking just for a 10-minute conversation. And nobody turns down a 10-minute conversation. Oh, thank you so much. Okay. Sorry, pause. Halftime. Where's the blue band? Thank you. Where was I? What was the last thing I said? Anybody remember? 10-minute calls, right. Okay, this is the golden ticket. I promise you. Pretty much anybody will accept a 10-minute call because nobody, or meeting, because nobody asks for a 10-minute call or a 10-minute meeting. Everybody asks for an hour. But when you're busy, nobody has an hour, but everybody has 10 minutes. So if you ask somebody for 10 minutes and be incredibly, impeccably prepared, have 3 questions ready and an ask. And whatever you get to, you get to. But ultimately, particularly for those of you who are sort of looking to get into the workforce or even within the workforce and looking to grow in your career, disabled or not, but this is the golden ticket that works in a lot of different capacities. Have 2 questions, because if you want to know what is it like to work in a company, the best person to ask is somebody in the company. So if you want to know what it's like to work at Apple, for example, you look on LinkedIn and you find out that your neighbor's brother's daughter's cousin works at Apple. And you can ask your neighbor, to ask the cousin, to ask the brother, to ask the, is there somebody that I can talk to just for 10 minutes? Have your 2 questions. What is it like to work at Apple? How does Apple support the success of all of its employees even when there's great diversity, like people who might be learning English as a second language, people who have a variety of disabilities, people who work on different sides of the planet, and let the person on who knows best, because they're in it every day, explain to you how that goes. The 10-minute call, again, is a winning ticket, a golden ticket, because not only will you get the 10 minutes, but when you actually manage the 10 minutes, which is really 2 questions, you get to say, we're almost done with our 10 minutes, and I want to be respectful of your time. Would it be okay if I followed up with you again if I had another question? And if so, should I call or should I email you? Would it be okay if I connected with you on LinkedIn? And generally, you could go yes, no, lots of different ways, but if you've managed the conversation incredibly well and the person has additional time, they'll just stay on the phone with you. So you get all the information that you have, but you've got to be willing to show up. You've got to be willing to be very curious and very interested. You've got to be really willing to be open about why you're asking questions, not just sort of poking around like an investigative journalist. No offense to the College of Communications. And you've got to be willing to pivot, because they're going to give you information that may send you on a path that you didn't think you wanted to go on. And I think the information on the Fortune 100, 200 companies could be sort of one kind of thing. A lot of people aren't necessarily prepared to hear that because maybe they don't want to think about working in a really big company. But I will say, in the way that we're tracking, so this is the College of Health and Human Development, and one of the things that I liked about it as a student was the focus on the quality of life, which when you wanted to be a physician is really where you're going anyway. And I've run into some jerks in the workplace, don't get me wrong, but by and large, when you're working with individuals who are helping other individuals, which is what the College of Health and Human Development promotes, you're not going to run into as many jerks as some other industries that their approach is different and their want for exactly what they want, square peg, square hole, and their abilities to pivot and to be really warmly welcoming of talent regardless of packaging maybe doesn't exist quite as much, or maybe not so predispositioned right now. It's changing. It really is changing. Did I unpack what you were going for, or did I take us in the wrong direction? You're very welcome.
Okay, one last question. Is that Carla? Hi. Way in the back. Well, we'll do 2 questions. How about that? We'll do Carla and then you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your story. It was really inspiring. My question was, could you talk a little bit about your consulting group that you started and why you felt the need to start a public health consulting group? Because I'm actually interested in pursuing consulting.
So my career tracked in a really interesting way. As I mentioned, I had wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. I still say I can be, it's just that I won't get malpractice insurance from anybody, and that's the real problem. And I ended up working at an orthopedic hospital, a specialty orthopedic hospital in New York, so that kind of came full circle. So I got the hospital experience, and over time, I just needed to grow professionally. So I joined a different kind of not-for-profit and got some new experiences, including disaster response because Hurricane Katrina had happened at that time. And then I went to grow some more professionally and joined at an executive level, another not-for-profit organization. And from there I went to the dark side, as they call it, but it's not so dark. The pharmaceutical industry is an amazing industry in the United States in particular. Ridiculously smart people who are trying to cure people of all sorts of things. But the pharmaceutical industry, like any other publicly traded or corporate for-profit organization, pharma is as pharma does, as I say. And so when another company was coming to market with a medication that was going to work better and faster, the company that I worked for shut down the entire franchise and ultimately had a 22% worldwide workforce layoff, which included me, it included everyone on my team, it included lots of really talented people. But if they weren't going to be in that space with that particular medication, why have anybody working on it? You just can't have people on payroll just to sort of sit around and play solitaire all day. So at that point, I decided, well, it's kind of like sitting in the retina specialist's office saying, well, if I can't operate in a hospital, I'll operate the entire hospital. I was sort of like, well, I've been gainfully employed my entire career, so I'll just start my own thing. And that's kind of what happened. The intent was to sort of do the same kind of work that I had been doing over the course of my career, and how it's actually tracked is that folks have wanted to tap into my brain, my way of thinking, my way of approach, because since I see the world in a very different way than a fully sighted person, it's actually trained my brain to think in a different way. And my sweet spot when it comes to business is at that senior executive level, and so to be able to bring a unique point of view and a lot of experience in different sectors so I can kind of speak different languages. And I've cultivated high-performance teams and gotten some really amazing outcomes over time because I just so happen to be this collection of lots of different unique experiences compared to a lot of other folks. I've been tapped in some different ways, not just in that public health consulting space. So the point of starting the company was just to do what I do, and then I was just open to pivot to let it grow as it needed to be and as folks wanted it to be. Mm-hmm.
One more question or comment. Yes. That's way in the back.
I'm good.
Well, we need it for the streaming.
Howdy again.
Hi.
As someone who wants to go into hospital administration and work my way eventually into management, I want to know what you think is the best way to help out differently abled employees.
To help out?
Differently abled employees,
Okay.
although we can't directly ask. If they tell us something they struggle with, what do you think is the best way to handle that?
Oh, well, kind of like my talk here today, I don't bifurcate between people who are disabled and people who are so-called normal, because ultimately everybody's got something that they're not good at and something that they need help with. So my management and leadership style has just been to approach the individual and figure out what the right solution is. If you're cultivating individuals over time in particular, there's no cookie cutter answer. It really is more of a concierge service type of thing. And the best managers and the best leaders make that specific investment knowing that they also can't invest in everyone in that way. So there are some generalized pieces and some framework and standardization, but then take it to the next level where it really makes a lot of sense, and there are lots of factors that go into that. I think if someone's going to share with you an area of growth that they'd like to achieve, the working conversation is, how do we do that together? Because it's great when, as a manager, it's great when someone comes to me with a problem, because it lets me know that they're paying attention, they've got analytical skills, they've got critical thinking skills, and they really can see what's going on and something that needs to be fixed. The next best step is to actually have someone come to you with the problem and 2 to 3 solutions. So not just someone who highlights the problem, but someone who's also thinking about defining the problem and solving the problem. And that really creates the foundation for the framework, because someone who's looking for a solution that they're not necessarily accountable for is not necessarily someone who's going to be invested in the outcome, which can really go down a quick spiral in a negative direction. For someone who you notice needs some growth area, there are lots of opportunities with that kind of thing in the workplace, with performance reviews and that sort of stuff. Some people are a little bit more open, so as a manager, you learn how to work effectively with your teams to get the best out of them, or the best managers do. Really good managers do that. But it's really paying attention and understanding what your team needs or what individuals need to be successful in their role. Again, I go back to the football thing, and it totally is because I went to Penn State. But if we think about, you can't have a football team entirely made up of quarterbacks. And even if you have multiple people in a position, one position, you need to figure out how to cultivate the best that's in them, because no two people are the same. So I'm answering your question in two ways. One is your direct question, what if somebody comes to you? And the second is the opposite, when you notice something else. But I think the most important point is to have a very trusted relationship with those employees, so that they know that you're not exposing their vulnerabilities, and they keep coming to you and then ultimately to others for their ongoing growth and professional development.
Well, we can't thank you enough, Susan, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have a tradition for the Distinguished Alumni Lecture. We want you to have a little memento of this talk.
Ooh, I love mementos.
And it is a framed print of your poster.
Oh, I love
which turned out
it.
pretty wonderful.
So I will say, a bunch of my TED folks saw this, and they were so impressed. So my TED Talk was the culminating event of my TED residency, which is a 14-week incubator time for ideas worth spreading, as TED calls them. And they welcomed me into the TED residency class, and now I'm part of that family. So when I was so honored to be excited and honored to be to be here today, invited to be here today, and when this poster, it was just so, I'm still a little speechless about it, because it really is quite gorgeous. And I threw it up on our TED residency Facebook page, and I was like, look what I'm doing. And everybody was like, wow, that's a good looking poster. So thanks for the good looking poster, but thanks also for inviting me back, and thanks for so many of you coming today to have a chat together. I really, really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate the invitation. It's an honor to be an alumni of the College of Health and Human Development.
Well, on that note,
thank you so much. This is amazing.
we've got some refreshments right outside in the hall, so feel free to stop and have something. And if you've got questions for Susan, I'm sure she'd be happy.
We've got wrapping for it to kind of keep it safe, too.
Yeah,
Oh, great.
Yeah,
I mean, whether we...
Yeah.
wrapped it just for the moment.
My mom will be in charge of this.
Yeah.